Okay, so if you remember, I probably should have introduced it a little bit just to refresh what we had last time. But he talked about he was made up his mind that he was going to go and study for the ministry, and so that's where it kind of starts out with. He was talking with handing in his resignation and the uncertainty it had, and he had gone and visited MLC and looked at the program there, and they said, "Now I know for sure it's not for me." But had eventually decided he was going to go through it, and then gets into that as after he had just started into this pursuing the ministry. But going back, he talks into his time with the police force again, and just this relationship with the chief, who eventually becomes the whole point of the story at the end there. But as you hear him talk about just day-to-day life, coming into the office or being around there with this man who eventually got to witness to. What presented Pastor Rosenau with the opportunity to eventually witness to his faith, or to his chief, directly the way he did in that hospital room? What things allowed him to get to that point?
They're at a crossroads. The chief is thinking that he might die on the operating table.
Yeah, so the thing that ultimately gives him that final chance of just going to go for it, just going to be real open about it, just going to talk about it, is a crossroads moment, as you called it, James. So he thinks he's going to die. He's facing this, what was it, the organ failure, and needs a transplant, and doesn't know if he's going to make it, and every other person will look at this and say, what a horrible situation, what a terrible situation that God would let someone go through. But what was it? It was the chance to witness. But even going back further than that, what were some of the things he talked about earlier on that set him up really for that? You might say that one moment. Eugene.
The chief said to him that he loved him.
Yeah. So they'd obviously developed their relationship through the years working together, where the chief felt comfortable saying something like that to him. And what things do you think would have made him comfortable hearing about some of their other stories, like say the duck hunting and things like that?
It kind of sounded like the chief was almost a little bit of a jerk. I mean, kind of. And so with him just being nice to him and treating him like an old person and inviting him to go out to the duck line, and not, when he went to the duck line, not forcing his religion on him, but just, he was just, and pretty much saying, I'm the same kind of person you are. I mean, we're all in this together. We're all, we all need a savior.
Yeah. So what you said was he didn't force his religion upon him, but what did he do? And you kind of said it, but what's another way that we could?
Well, he kind of left the door open.
Yeah, he made it clear that he did have a religion, we might say, that he did have faith. There was no hiding the faith at any point. Even if you recall what the chief said to him there, he said, "What makes you different?" And then, like you said, Gene, he said he wasn't different. He made it clear that he was a sinner, just in the same way as whatever the chief thought was wrong with him. David.
Now, we talk about wanting to make opportunities for witnessing and all of that good stuff, but the initiator in all this is the chief. He comes in and says, hey, invite me to take you duck hunting. And then he says, hey, what makes you different? And then when he's about to go to surgery, he calls him up long distance.
Yeah.
And, so the chief is the initiator.
Right. The chief is the initiator.
The pastor is just simply taking his opportunities that are already given to him.
Well, in addition to, the chief was the initiator, but the chief wouldn't have said what makes you different if this man had not been living his faith.
Yeah. So those, and we've gotten to the really the two big important things. Oh, before I go, yeah, Terry.
I was just going to say the chief felt that he was missing something.
Yeah.
There's like an empty space there that he's trying to fill.
Yeah, if we want to bring in a third party into this discussion of who was doing what, there was also God. correct? Not that you were overlooking that, but kind of it's a given. So, but let's say it. You know, God was there, as Terry said, showing the chief that he's missing something, that natural knowledge of God, whether it be from the works of creation or the conscience that's within you. I mean, when he said, "You don't know who I am," that's an admission of the guilt of conscience. But you're right, David. There was no grand moment where Pastor Rosenau goes to his chief and says, "Now I need to tell you about Jesus." It was all the other way, and as the opportunity came to himself, really as God presented him the opportunity, he witnessed. But as I said, that there's two important things there. It was clear and it was evident to this chief, and certainly to other people, I would assume, that Pastor Rosenau, not at that time pastor yet, was different. Now, was he really doing anything that he would have thought was making him stand out that much? Probably not. I mean, when he talks about it, he very much just says he was going about his job faithfully. He would take care of his family the best that he could. He would go to church, probably as regularly as he could, given his circumstance. But none of those things were, you might say anything fantastic. And certainly he would admit that they weren't anything great, and he didn't do them perfectly. They didn't earn him anything, and yet it stood out to the point where the chief could come. And that brings us to part number 2, which is something that we do want to emphasize, especially, I feel, especially as we watch something like this, where we do hear some pretty cool stories about witnessing. And you get to listen to a guy who is pretty gifted at witnessing and at just speaking, and just in general, very gifted, is that these situations very often are presented to you by the Lord. So David, thanks for highlighting that point. Because just like we said last time too about suffering and martyrdom, you don't have to go seeking out hard times; they'll find you. Witnessing too is not necessarily something where you have to go seeking out, as we said, as the title of this is, the courage to do what is uncomfortable and inconvenient. You don't have to seek out the uncomfortable, because that'll find you too. The situation where he's there in the duck blind, depending upon what kind of person you are, how you're feeling that day, that could be kind of uncomfortable too. You could just, someone tells you that, and you're okay, kind of moment of silence, and you move on to the next topic. The key is, instead of just moment of silence, move on to the next topic, when you have something that can help that person, which you do, because you know the gospel, to share it. And there might be that slight moment of uncomfortableness, but the healing that it can give is demonstrated in a story like that. And we see it too. Some considerable time would have passed between that duck hunting incident and the hospital visit. That seed was planted, and it clearly grew. As the seed was planted, God watered that seed, and it grew into something more, up to the point where we could say the gospel was definitely shared with that man, and you'd have a good chance of figuring he believed that, he needed that. So we talked about having opportunities presented to us, and we highlighted that standing out as different is a good thing in terms of your Christianity being apparent. So how are some ways that you can put your faith on display, even without directly talking about it? We're talking about little things, so we might have to really work at it in our minds here to identify some of those things that maybe we take for granted, but that are good ways to show our faith without even having to directly talk about it.
Being honest, say, I've been in stores where the cashier accidentally gave me an extra $10 bill or a $1 bill, and I'll count it. Well, mainly, if anything, I've been shortchanged on a lot of occasions, but when I do count it, I end up with the extra $10 on hand to give it back to the cashier, and one day they might question what motivates me to be good in that way.
Yeah, and it's a small thing, but you're interacting with the person, and again, it's a small thing. And if you take a small thing so seriously to do the right thing, it stands out, because again, it's such a small thing. At the very least, you're at the store, you're like, well, they're probably ripping me off on their prices, so I might as well take their dollar. Something little like that, in the way that you interact in the world. Certainly, other thoughts, other ideas. John?
Your language when you're out there amongst all the people, and if you've got a job and you're out there working, your language tells a lot about you too.
Yeah, that is a big one. And more, just foul language is becoming commonplace because it's hitting the media and everything. So people think that's just the way everyone ought to talk. So even more so probably than in the past, you'd stand out. Isaac and then Ann.
Say like workplaces, like if I hear people swearing a lot, I feel compelled to jump in and say like, don't hey, stop talking like that, but that would be, directly probably taking too much upon myself. But there's also times, like I have a couple of Christian coworkers and, we'll talk about our faith, not every day, but occasionally. And so one thing I like to do at my desk is just keep a Bible there with me. And, coworkers have noticed that. They're like, oh, I noticed you keep the Bible there. So I don't talk about it, but they see it's part of my life.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a great thing. And like you said, sometimes, especially if, like you said, there's other coworkers and you feel the need to step in, you're not just doing it because it's because you know it's wrong and because perhaps it's offensive to you, but it's for them as well. So there's certainly something to be said for that. But like you said, a little thing. It's apparent. You're not hiding it. Your light's not under the bushel. No, it's out there in the open. And
Well, when he said that, I thought of two things. But the first one I thought of was just like making time to go to church. It's like, can you arrange your life so that it's not like, hey, I'm a Christian, and I'm a good person because I'm going to church, but kind of making it known with not forcing it, saying, hey, I usually go to church Sunday morning, so I'm kind of busy. And I've ran into that at work. And we actually worked out so I could go Easter. I went to the early church and hurried into work so the other guy could go to late church on an Easter Sunday, which is kind of cool. The other thing, when he was talking about the swearing, there was a guy I used to work with, and he would start swearing, and he'd look at me and say, I'm so sorry. And I was going, why are you telling me you're sorry? You know better already. So, why are you doing this?
yeah. Yeah. And those are little moments, too, where you can maybe even, how do I want to say this? You can maybe even give them a little nugget of truth. Like, I can think of a story from back this fall when I was playing some adult sports leagues here. And I think it was the language thing, too. Someone said something, and then they're like, oh, shouldn't say that when the pastor's around. And I just was like, I mean,
God's still around.
yeah, that's what I said. I said it doesn't matter if I'm here or not. God still hears you wherever you are. Personally, it doesn't bother me a whole lot, but God would not want you to talk that way. So, like I said, and you have your relationships. So with these people, especially with the coworkers, you know them to a certain degree, so you know how you can talk to them. And like we said, we're planting seeds really for when something does come up, and they'll see you as the person to go to, and you might be shocked that all of a sudden you're the person that someone is coming to. But just know you're prepared for it because there's a reason why they're coming to you. David, I think saw your hand.
The line is, I'm not the one you need to apologize to.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Good.
Here.
When I was a
Wish
case
I could.
manager in one of the homes, I would look around, and these were mostly elderly people who were homebound, and I looked around, and if there was any type of a Christian symbol in their home, I'd say, oh, I see you have a cross on the wall. That just opened up the conversation, as part of my assessment. I always did that, and it gave them the opportunity to talk also.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something we've emphasized too, is giving opportunity for the other person to talk, because they're probably going to get to that thing that's on their conscience at some point.
That is the same in public school. We couldn't talk about Jesus, but if the children would talk to us about Jesus, we could talk back with them.
Sure. Let's take a look at question 2. When Pastor Rosenau told the chief that the important thing for guys like us is to know that Jesus is our Savior, and the chief replied, "You have no idea who I really am," what do you suppose he meant? what do you suppose the chief meant saying, you don't know who I really am?
He knew how bad he was, Ben.
Yeah, how bad he was. Myron, again.
Yeah, he, being chief for the long time that he was, you know, he may have, like, had to kill a person. So, you know, was trying to kill him or otherwise, you know, you don't know that. If he's running dope, you know, undercover, that's even worse yet, probably. Seeing people being shot, you know, bodied.
Yeah.
That's nothing I would want to
And given his line of work, the things that he likely was involved in, and then knowing too, if we think back to, I think it was the first video, wherever it was where he talks about getting into narcotics, you know, and doing this undercover work, and the thing that he was told about most guys either, you know, leave here divorced and, you know, dead or worse. So apply that to someone who's probably experienced the same things that lead to someone saying something like that, and you can understand why he would say, you have no idea who I really am. You know, on one side, he's a chief of police, he's trying to uphold law and good, and yet the other side, what he sees in the mirror for himself is probably a lot of absence of good and a lot of evil there in himself.
I don't know,
Yes.
I'm talking too much, but.
That's fine.
But you have to, the good thing, though, that you can work with is the chief acknowledges he's a sinner. And probably with your peers, your generation, there's not that acknowledgement,
Yeah.
you know?
That's a really good point. I actually want to talk about that, but let's hold on to that until after the next question, because that's a really good thing to talk about. But first, when we get the people who do recognize their sin, and maybe they're talking about it in an abstract way because they don't know how to define sin, they don't know the term sin, but they're talking about sin. How do we show people that say that God stuff is not for me, and particularly in this case, because I'm too bad for it? How do we show them that that's exactly for them?
You don't do it in one sentence.
Use yourself as an example.
That's some good wisdom there. You don't do it in one sentence. You probably don't do it in one day either, no matter how many sentences you speak. Terry, what was that you said? I
I'm
think.
just saying, use yourself as an example, that's what he did.
Yeah. Yeah, using yourself as an example. And that doesn't mean you have to get into all the nitty gritty of, you know, here's back in high school the bad thing that I did, and then 2 years later, here's the bad thing I did. And here's something that I've never told you. You don't need to do that.
No, you know better than him.
But-
That, you know,
Yeah, to use yourself as the example, and then to tie in there the fact that we're all sinful from birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. It doesn't even matter if, you know, in that case they're both in the same line of work, experience a lot of the same things, they could relate. It doesn't even matter, the innocent little preschool teacher, and I'm not picking on Eugene and Nancy, but the innocent little preschool teacher also is just as sinful of a sinner as, you know, the hardened cop who's had to endure a lot of things. Again, using yourself as the comparison, being able to draw that universal nature of sinfulness, and to admit, yeah, you are bad. But that's exactly what Jesus came for. It is for a sinner like you. The Apostle Paul called himself chief of sinners. And he did a lot of things that you could actually look at and see were really bad too, killing Christians. And certainly there were probably other things that bothered Paul just as much as that we don't know about his failings in there. Miss Vicki, and then a couple hands up here.
I think it also, you need to start out with a good attitude when you're witnessing to someone in a loving manner that gets their attention more than being, aggressive. It's just how you approach the situation. I think that has a lot to do with people listening.
Yeah. Terry. Yeah.
I said that, you couldn't say it in that one sentence, but what was going through my mind was that sinners, though I be, Jesus crucified for me. And so I think it's good to be bold sometimes too, and just say it, you know, Jesus died for me and I'm a sinner.
Yeah.
You know, and you toss that out and, you know, who knows?
Yeah, and another encouragement in terms of when it does come time to saying is, you know, Jesus talking about this, the Holy Spirit giving you the words to say. It will not be you speaking, but the Spirit as you testify before these councils and trials and whatever else it is. That you know, you don't have to come up with it all on your own. You might be surprised after the moment what God has granted you the ability to say. Isaac, and then Gene.
I was still thinking about the question I was gonna ask, because.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll
We'll
wait.
give you a moment. Gene.
Well, I was gonna say too, you can address where you see his concerns and where you can tell that he's struggling. So when he says, you have no idea who I really am, he's feeling bad about who he thinks he really is right then. And, you know, I may not know who you really are, but God does, and he still loves you. I mean, and what he gives me, he has for you too. And so, sometimes you have to not make it about yourself, but, I mean, figure out what they're struggling with, and gently guide them.
Yeah. So
And don't call him a jerk like I just said earlier, actually. So maybe challenging to get along with.
Yeah.
Just type A.
Just a few things to kind of summarize some of what the good thoughts that have been shared. You know, you're not going to get a chance to talk to people if you're a rude and reclusive. Not that you have to be the most social person, but if you're a rude person that doesn't really have a relationship with the person, that, you know, only comes around when it's time to, you know, put someone down. We understand that. First of all, like, you got to show some decency to be recognized. Otherwise, you're going to be a hypocrite, right? You talk about love, you talk about forgiveness, and yet you show none of those things in your life. And at the same time, as much as we do want to defend the faith and defend God, that's not our primary concern, because ultimately God doesn't need our defending. God can take care of himself. What he does need us to do is to be witnesses, to share the truth in love about that. And then, like you said, yeah, to be a friend, to witness when we call on. Forgot the last thing I was going to say. Anyway, Isaac, did you come up with your?
Yeah, so when we were talking about like examples of, say, like how showing them that Jesus is for them too.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't summarize it better than Karen. Like, I think it's best to start with the simple stuff, but then if they bring up, like I had a coworker bring up an example of like, for example, I know there's some stories of like a murderer or something who, you know, came to know Jesus after all the bad stuff, and that seems so offensive to us, like how to forgive someone like that when we're comparing ourselves. So how do you go about like handling that? Say if someone came to you and asked, like, oh, what, like, how could God actually forgive like a murderer or something, like a serial killer or something?
Yeah. I guess one thing you could go to is what Jesus says about murder, right? If anyone says, what's the word, raka, emptiness, you know, calls his brother basically an empty-headed fool, he's committed murder in his heart. Hate is murder. It might take a little bit for that to resonate with the person, but even logically, you can kind of draw that out. If you hate somebody, what do you want? You want them to not be there, right? You don't want them to interact with you. Yeah, what's the easiest way to do that? Sure, you can ship them off to some island, but probably the easiest way is just, you know, get rid of them. Now, you don't want to do that because there's some repercussions. You know, the law's going to come after you. It might be a messy kind of thing to do, but in your mind, you're saying, if this person could just not be here, not exist, stop existing, that would make me really happy. What is that? That's murder. You can even see the logical connection in what Jesus is saying there. You know, even with our human mind, to not even go into the spiritual realm. But then too, it doesn't matter if it's murder or any other sin. The soul that sins is the one who dies, the one who will die, God says through Ezekiel. And some of these things, they're not going to be logical necessarily, because the message about Christ is not per se a logical message. We call it foolishness for a reason, but the Spirit works through the Word. And what is the Word? The Word is the truth. So if we have to share the truth, that's going to look foolishness, but the truth is there, sometimes that's what it is. You get a follow-up?
Thank you, yeah, that's just really hard to accept, especially what we mentioned earlier with our generation. It's like, I don't want to believe that I was born like sinful,
Yeah.
It's hard to accept that.
It's a good transition to that question. And I'll just say, too, I mean, think of the people in Jesus' day. This is a hard teaching. Who can understand that? They said that a couple times. But yeah, transitioning to the thing that David brought up about the young and by and large, the younger generations, and you can put that line wherever you want. In reality, perhaps the sinful nature, or the fact that I'm born sinful, you can go way back in history and find the seeds of where today's society has blossomed into that. I suppose you could go back to the fall, but let's talk about that. And maybe not all of us will encounter it as much as we can, just based off of the demographic that we might interact with, but we do all know people in every age group. And there is a lot of that in, I would say, in younger people, and just in general, it's the influence of society that no matter how old you are, you can be influenced by that thought of what really is sin. I'm not sinful. Sin is something that either church people care about, when you say a bad word, or sin is something that, like you said, murderers do, rapists do, war criminals do. How do you teach somebody who doesn't believe in a concept of sin that they're sinful and need a savior? Because going back to, I think I remember one thing I wanted to say about Gene's answer about how he treated the chief in the duck line. He already knew. He already felt guilt, so you didn't really need to crush him with the law so much as maybe just define it so that you could move on to the clear and pure gospel. But in the case that we're talking about now, people who need to be crushed by the law, they need to know the seriousness of sin. How do you go about that? Maybe we won't come up with a great answer today because I think it's a difficult question. But how do we go about that? Terry?
I'm thinking about conscience and how did it feel when you beat that person or whatever? Did it make you feel better, or did you feel some guilt? If you felt some guilt, then maybe you need to know that you are forgiven.
Yeah. So the matter of conscience probably still there. I just need to brush a few layers of dust off of it and pull it up out of the ground to get it to even where it's alive and having much of an impact. But like you said, identifying, and maybe it's just as simple in some cases as identifying that feeling that you have. Like that's not just some feeling that you have. No, we can give that a name. We can give that a definition. You might get some pushback on that, because that means all of a sudden I have to face consequences. I have to conform to a rule. I have to, whatever it may be.
Much better than those consequences.
But right, it's much better than the eternal consequences. You're right, and there's peace with that. I think that's another big thing with current generations, especially the youth. But even I'll say all the way up to like people in their 30s and 40s. And again, not exclusive to those groups, but in general, trends is this notion of anxiety and you might say despair over identity. And we're talking in our worship about identity, Christian identity, but there's a lot of anxiety, and a lot of that is attached to fulfillment and meaning in life. And what am I doing? What am I getting out of this? I look at, as an American, the foundations of society that perhaps parents or grandparents grew up on, where they could expect certain things of life as they got older, and they'd reach these milestones and they'd find happiness in those things, even though that's also a little bit of a farce. And yet those are crumbling around people who are reaching adulthood, who are entering into high school, where they're starting to think about their career, and kids pick up a lot more than we think, so they're already hearing these things, and they're not ready to grow up yet, but they hear about growing up, and they're filled with the anxiety from little on. maybe you first need to give them a definition of even who they are as people, and then what Christ offers them before you can even start talking about sin and grace. I'm just kind of throwing some things out there. Gene?
Well, I guess I struggle with the idea that people think that they don't do things wrong. I mean, do they not understand the definition of what sin is? And I guess, like, just as an example, in the case of when Anne was talking about the person in the bad language, and they would say they were sorry to her, so they knew there was something kind of offensive about what they were doing. I mean, I've had people that have used bad language around me, and after a while, when they've spent time with me and we've talked and stuff, and if I'm not using the bad language, they just stop using it. I mean, it's not like I say anything to them, and there's no discussion about it, but you can control that. I mean, like, when you're in a work environment, you don't just, well, I guess sometimes they do, but like if you're working with the public or something, you're not gonna use foul language when you're just talking to them. You inherently kind of know that there's something a little wrong with that, I guess. And so, for the people that say they don't sin, do you think they just don't really understand what a definition of sin is?
Well, yeah,
I
Karen.
had a friend like 50 years ago who had a new baby, and she could not believe that this baby was sinful. Not my baby, baby crying a lot, giving all these different examples, and it was a friendship over a period of years, and it never came to my church, but that whole family of kids and mom who did go to another church, and they were Christians, and they were believers, and it was just kind of a process over time, and then, I called her one day, and she had cancer, and I didn't even know it. I kept in touch with people, in my lifetime, and we had the best conversation in the world. That was, years and years later.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to what you said, Gene, do they, any person, no matter how open and free-thinking they want to say they are, they're going to have limits in some kind of limit.
Right, you act differently around your grandma than you do around.
Right. So that's kind of going back to what Terry said. Like the conscience is still there, but it might just be very dull. It might be buried and dull, and they're trying to suppress it as much as they can. So, like I said, those are logical ways to kind of highlight that. Think too about society at large, the things that they want to cancel. The cancel culture. That's because it offends them. So they have some kind of standard, but they're making their own standard. And like I said, we could connect them to the Pharisees in many ways. We can connect ourselves to the Pharisees really in any narrative from the gospel. We're probably going to be looking at ourselves as the Pharisees, as whatever person Jesus is comforting and defending. And then, of course, the key figure in all of those is Jesus, because he's the one who's dividing the law and gospel for us in the real life situation. But yeah, getting back to the matter of them justifying themselves is people are a law unto themselves. And the Bible talks about that too, right? The Gentiles not having the law are a law unto themselves. And they know some of the things that are right to do and some of the things that are wrong, but it's not the revealed law of God, so it's not going to be right in every situation. And so often it's about what's good for me, what's good for the things that are close to me, my family, my friends, the things that I like to do. If I take part in supporting the LGBTQ plus community by saying, yeah, Pride Month, and I got my flag, and I put my little hashtag on my Facebook post, well, no one's going to bat an eye at me because I'm just going along with the flow with them. And that makes things a lot easier for me. It makes things a lot more comfortable for me. Do I really, am I really out there and saying, like, this is such a great thing and I really care about it? Probably they don't care, to be honest with you. It's like the joke about, Pride Month comes around and every corporation changes their logo to a rainbow flag. Why? Because they want your money. Because they don't want to rock the boat. And then they're going to go right back to whatever they do because they only care about themselves. Well, people operate in much the same way because it's people who run corporations, right? But we know we have a truth. And we gotta go back to the gentleness and the lovingness. And we don't wanna just entrench ourselves and say, well, homosexuality is wrong, so you better repent now or burn forever in the fires of hell. What are they gonna say? They say, okay, well, I'm done with you. Yeah. Like, you gotta make it meaningful. And it's really gonna take relationships. I mean, it's going back to what Terry told us about, from our example with Pastor Rosenau. He was a friend to this chief, clearly, that when times get tough, you know who your friends are. You're gonna go to the person who's not going to judge you, but is gonna actually help you. And maybe you don't know what you're expecting from them, but you got more hope in that person than you do going somewhere else or not going anywhere at all. I think of what Jesus said. The Son of Man did not come into the world to condemn the world, John 3:17, but to save the world. Yeah, Jesus is coming to judge. It's real. God's law is real. He is just. But that's not what the gospel is about. Law and gospel are two separate things. We need both of them. But they're not to be mixed. Isaac.
I was already starting to forget what you said earlier. It's all about, it's not our defending of Jesus. It's kind of like, it seems like we're not even on the offensive or defense. We're just sharing. So it's like if a coworker tests your faith or something, you want to just share it with them, and then maybe at a later point in the future they'll come back to you if they're having hard times or something.
It's like the expression evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread.
That's right.
It could be years later that the impact we've had could be revealed, and we never know. Isaac having the Bible laying next to him at his desk could just be enough of an action that someone is curious enough or remembers Isaac 5 years from now and says, hey, he was a decent guy who did live his life differently. What made him different, much like the chief and the pastor? And Isaac will never know that even hurt. That's just God working through us in ways we never realize. That's
Yep. That's exactly right. Let's take a look at question 3. Let's try to get through these here at the end. What question did Pastor Rosenau ask his chief in the hospital room that gets to the heart of the matter, but it's not invasive? Yeah, can I share Jesus with you? And I think if I remember, I don't remember his exact wording, but it was something along the lines of telling you about the thing that's important. It's not invasive because, like you said, it's a question. If they say no, I suppose at that point you're like, you either say, okay, or you say, are you sure? I'd really like to. But probably no, a few people are gonna turn you down when you ask them a question like that. And yeah, the non-invasive question and the fact that it's important to, it's not his truth, but it is a truth that he possesses, to make that distinction there. And just a question to follow up with that, and maybe one that just allows us to be in perspective for a moment. Why do we hesitate to take the conversation to spiritual matters if it does matter so much to us? And the truth we know is truth.
Rejection.
Yep.
Yeah, rejection. So rejection's on one side. What do we want to remember on the other side?
The rejection isn't you, it's the rejecting God.
Yeah. Rejecting God, not you, Isaac.
One of Jesus' parables that he said something about don't give jewelry to pigs or something.
Yeah, don't cast the pearls before swine. Yeah, there's something said about that, about those who are, I guess you'd say what, defiant and openly hardened against what you're doing. Obviously, because it's a parable, there's something to be said for that.
Does that mean you don't try with them, or you just give up quicker? Or? Because I thought you're supposed to like shake the dust off your feet, and you're not going to have anything to do with them anymore. In a case like that, but you tried the first time anyway.
Yeah. That's maybe another good separate discussion to have. Might not fit as great right here with this, but something to talk about, because like we said, those are two things that Jesus talks about. Myron, I think saw your hand. We'll come back to that, if not today, maybe next time.
I think we talk about it. Pearl, the daily devotion today is about the guy that sold all his possessions so he could go buy the pearl.
Right.
And daily devotion today, well,
Yeah, so talking about the valuable treasure, I think that's applicable here, is not only remembering that they're not rejecting you, really, they're rejecting the truth, is that what you have is so valuable that you can't help but share it no matter what the consequence. And again, by your own strength, by your own willpower, are you going to be able to do that? Probably not, especially after you've been rejected once or twice. But where's the strength going to come from? It's going to come from God.
Shutting the door on somebody because maybe we're just doing sort of God's plan, someone else is doing something behind us, but if we shut that door and says, well, what's that? You know, that's gonna make it even harder for that next person to also maybe the way they phrase it or however God uses that to reach that person that you can't reach them. So I think keeping it open-ended is probably better, you know.
Yeah. And each situation is going to call for its own prayerful consideration and wisdom that God has given to us. But there certainly is a time where, and we could draw parallels to a matter of excommunication, where you're dealing with someone who's a believer and they're in an unrepentant sin. What is excommunication? It's not saying, well, you're out of the church because we don't like you here anymore. It's hard presentation of the law, because that's exactly what that person needs. It might be a case, too, where the unbeliever needs a hard and firm presentation of the law. And maybe that's what has to sit with them until the next person can come along. But like you say, we're not people who can see into hearts and judge faith. So it's not really our job to write someone's eternal welfare off, or their eternal destiny, however I want to say it. Now let's take a quick look at the next question. How can true love sometimes mean doing the difficult thing? I think we've talked about it a lot, but if we just want to maybe get an answer to that. Terry?
Just using an example of that's the thing. He gets on a plane and to do what he did, you know, that had to reach, that's love, you know.
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing, in a number of ways. Not only is he going to show up and kind of take an uncomfortable situation and just meet it head on, but he's got to jump through some hoops to even get there too. What do you say? He got off work at 2 a.m. and he gets on a plane. The financial cost of that, the physical toll of doing that, and then all to do what? To set yourself up for I mean, you might do that if like, hey, I'm going to go on a trip, I'm going to have a vacation, I'm going to get off work and go. But no, to set myself up for something uncomfortable. Yeah, that's one way.
Remember, the guy told him that he loved him, and that was not a normal thing.
Yeah.
Probably for either of them. And so he probably saw, here's the chance to go, if I make it in time, to go talk to him about Jesus.
Yeah. Paul, is that him?
Well, that's just a display of love in action rather than love in words. Love in action spoke a lot to that chief. I mean, this guy did this for me after I said I loved him. He actually showed me how much he loved me.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot.
Yep. And then the last question, as we come to close here, what's the emphasis about making just one visit? Kind of the last thing we heard him say.
That could be all you get.
So one thing, it could be all you get. Yeah, definitely. Nancy?
He reached all those thousands or hundreds of other police officers by that one visit.
Yeah.
Came to faith in
That
at the funeral.
through that, it reached other people, and don't lose sight of the fact that that one soul is precious. Yeah, it certainly offered opportunity to witness at the funeral. It offered opportunity for him to tell a meaningful story that we're hearing, that many other people are hearing. But it's also just about that one soul that he was able to reach. It goes back to his story about Joanne, the first woman that we heard about. If it was all just for her, it was worth it. If he gets back on his plane, goes back to Minnesota, it crashes, and he dies, it was all worth it for the one man that he got to witness to in the hospital room. If the funeral never happens and no one else hears, but God does bring it to other people, and you're exactly right. Through one little thing, the big things that follow it. But let's not lose sight of how big it is to reach just one person. And so, like I said, the rejection that we may face, the uncomfortable situations that we may face, we're ready for them because we've got Christ with us. And it's so valuable, so important. And there's nothing that any person can do to us that is so bad that it's not worth sharing with them the precious pearl of the truth of the gospel. Any last comments, questions as we wrap up? Gene?
Kind of in a selfish way, don't you feel that witnessing strengthens God uses that to strengthen your self-faith too?
Yeah, absolutely. How could it not, to see the gospel work?
Or even if
To
it
be
doesn't
part of
work, it's a reminder that it's all about God, it's not about you.
And we have that example from the Bible too, right? Those disciples who were whipped and beaten because of Christ, they left rejoicing because they had suffered for Christ. You know that if you're suffering, that's in one of John's epistles too. Like, what good is it if someone gives you punishment, if you receive bad things for doing bad things? Like that's how it's supposed to work. If you do bad things, but if you receive bad things for doing good, then you know the good that you have done. And talking about good in terms of faith, living out acting in faith. And two, we lose sight of the fact that God does take care of us, right? If we happen to get into a situation where we're witnessing it now, we're going to be persecuted. Whatever, we'll use broad terms here. But we're going to be persecuted. And now, if I put myself into a situation where all of a sudden I'm going to be persecuted, how miserable are my days and years going to be? And how long is this going to go on? As if the Lord doesn't clothe the lilies of the field and not a sparrow falls from the sky without him knowing about it. And so you're going to be forever, miserable because of one thing. Might be uncomfortable for longer than you want, but he's certainly not going to leave you floundering for forever. All right, why don't we close with prayer then, as we're right about that time. Thanks for all the answers and the discussion this morning. Let's pray. Dear Lord God, we thank you for the gift of your love, your mercy, the gift of the gospel that you have shared with each one of us. It's certainly something that we don't deserve, and yet because you loved us, you shared it with us. Help us to also show that kind of love to others who are lost. Help us to also be an encouragement to those who do have your word, but may be struggling, may at times be going through difficult things, because we know that happens to all of us. And yet that does not mean that you have forgotten about us or that you don't remember us, but that you are drawing us closer to you. All these things we ask in Jesus' name.